Well, welcome everyone to Psychology to Live By. Today is a Q&A with some lovely people, and our topic's going to be embracing uncertainty. And the participants today have watched the podcast of that name, which you can see on the website if you go to drchris.life. But just to give you a sense of that podcast before we go to our Q&A, human beings hate uncertainty. We're hardwired to really dislike it. And no doubt this had survival advantages on the African savannah a couple of 100,000 years ago. What we evolved to use are things called schemas, which are like quick and dirty appraisals of reality. And these have worked remarkably well, but they do come with systematic biases, errors, overgeneralizations and the like. And they do cause us to fall out of touch with reality from time to time. And so the question is, what can be done about that? And fortunately, we also come hardwired in particular circumstances with ways of transcending these errors and biases. And we'll no doubt discuss those. But I think this is a very relevant topic in our time, given the extraordinary polarization that we see and the importance of people being able to sort of transcend their biases. Alrighty, so to that end, I welcome my participants, and I'm very, very curious and interested to know what insights you had, what questions you had, so we can have a discussion about embracing uncertainty. Who's going to jump in?
I think Karen should go first.
Oh, well, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there, Dr. Chris, is when we're living in a time of uncertainty. And so I think, a question I would have is like, in developing tools in moving forward and coming out of a situation like the pandemic, and what it looks like in how we work, how we move into relating with each other, and just how to move forward positively and not going down a kind of rabbit hole of negativity when it comes to uncertainty.
Wow. Okay. We're starting with an easy question. I think that one of the things about the pandemic, as you know, is it has created a very long-term period of uncertainty, and that's had a deep impact on all of us. The term languishing has been used to capture something of the debilitating effect of long-term uncertainty, and I think we are slowly getting back to some sense of normality, but the pandemic is by no means finished with us. And so I think there's a couple of things to say at least. I think it helps to know that we're hardwired to dislike uncertainty, and to be able to maybe accept uncertainty a little bit more. And you may remember in the podcast, I talk about John Keats's notion of negative capability. And that's a kind of learning that we can sit with uncertainty, with ambiguity, and be more patient with it, not try to jump to conclusions. The other most important thing, I think, is feeling psychologically safe. When human beings are calm, that they can think a little bit more broadly, they can question their own assumptions. So I think coming out of the pandemic, especially with people coming physically together more, I think that's going to help. Oxytocin is released in people, and we know that has very beneficial effects on our body, but also on our mind. The mind becomes a bit more spacious, little bit more contemplative, a bit more creative. So I think anything that's going to facilitate those social connections. I mean, interestingly, in the pandemic, productivity went up quite a bit for quite a while when people were working from home, and people started to realise how much time they waste at work in social chit-chat and interaction. But now I think we're seeing the long-term cost of not having this so-called wasteful interactions, and it appears it's a really, really, really important, essential part of our long-term well-being. That's a long answer, and I'm sure I could say more, but we do have other participants who may have questions to ask.
So I never realized how good that name schema is, especially in today's context. But talking about biases, one, how can you calmly see your own bias? But just as importantly, how do you deal with whom you might think has a huge bias that is not connected to reality?
Yeah. Again, tricky questions. To start with the first part, so how does one of the problems with biases is that you don't know you've got it. All right, that's why it is a bias. The essence of it is we believe that's reality. So I think having a more general, once one understands how we are irredeemably biased, but by nature in this way, through schemas and quick and dirty appraisals, a certain humility is required, a sort of, in my loftier days, I called it an epistemological humility. Epistemology being the study of knowledge, what we can know. And so, in philosophy, that's a big piece of philosophy. But anyway, the point is to always know, to have some humility with respect to what we know, given that we know we're just taking a slice and it's a biased slice. Terry, I think it also shows up in our interactions with other people. So if other people disagree with the verity of what we're thinking, they might be right. So there is that sense of letting in that sort of difference.
So are you saying that their reaction, the severity of the reaction, the more severe it is, one should really think that maybe they might be the ones that are biased? Is that kind of where you're going?
But both possibilities are there. So the first, but where I was really focusing in there was part of the problem with polarization is when someone else disagrees with us, we become more polarized.
Yeah,
we double down on our thing, and then they double down on theirs. And in fact, there's evidence to that. It's somewhat controversial evidence, but the idea is there's a thing called a blowback effect, that when you're confronted with evidence that actually undermines your view, something that you hold dearly, especially if values are involved, you actually, even though there's definite countervailing evidence, you actually hold the view stronger. And if you think about, like anti-vaxxers, for example, no matter how much evidence you provide, they'll find a way. And of course, the same is true of the extremes on the other side of the debate. And so the first port of call is self. Now, to the second port of call, of course, other people will have their biases. And as soon as a person feels under attack, disrespected, they're gonna harden down on their biases. Yep. So there's a really important notion in the organizational psychology literature, a thing called psychological safety. And, it's kind of common sense, which is kind of maybe rare in psychology, but anyway, that when people feel known, they feel trusted, respected, accepted, their whole system relaxes. And when people are like that, when people are feeling relaxed, they're feeling safe, they can think a little bit more broadly. They can allow more of an opposing point of view in. Because one of the functions of these schemas and these very quick appraisals, heuristics, is they're designed to lower anxiety when confronted with complexity, when confronted with things that don't fit our expectations, all right? And if we can, as soon as self becomes, it feels under attack, there's a sort of hijack of the brain's resources towards defensiveness to protect self, right?
Yeah.
So we can take that out of the equation. There's more chance for real dialogue. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's all right.
So in the podcast, you talk about how people will, I think the word is overgeneralize to solve their anxiety or the uncertainty that they're facing.
Yes.
Is it possible that the other extreme is also an outcome of that, trying to control uncertainty, which is follow every thread to the nth possible degree so that you're making sure that you're accounting for every possible outcome?
Not talking about yourself here, are you, Chris?
Maybe a little bit, but are they manifest out of the same thing, out of the same place?
It's very interesting. I'll start somewhere and then see if I can get back to answering the question. But the first thing that occurred to me in listening to that is, although we all have this general architecture, of using schemas and so on and so on, we also have individual differences with respect to it. So there's this sort of universal human thing. And then within that, of course, as you know, people have very, very different personalities. And so if a person is super, super conscientious, they're high on a trait called conscientiousness, they're going to be doing what you just described. They're going to be, running down every potential possibility. And again, though, I think where your intuition is correct here is they do that for a sense of control. And all of this discussion is really about having some sense of control. And if a person is really low on conscientiousness, then they're not going to do that, and they'll just run with their schemas, right? But another personality dimension that's highly relevant here is one called openness to experience. And so the person who's very open to experience, they might be more creative, more entrepreneurial, et cetera, they're more likely to have more open schemas, if I can put it that way, right? And if they have that and they're also a bit neurotic, they're low on what we call emotional stability, another personality dimension, they could have some troubles. They could be, so it is more complex than just saying we have schemas.
Right.
It's going to interact with personality. But there's definitely people, such as you described, one way of trying to minimize this anxiety is to cover everything. But, of course, ultimately in life, you can't do that. So, I do a lot of work with in the, top-tier international law firms. And there's a lot of people like that. And they're great lawyers. But, but you can't, they often suffer deeply when things are out of their control. Mm. Yeah. Great question. Didn't know where that was going to go. What else?
So there's also, you speak about the best way to kind of to move past the schemas and the ways that we just naturally do this is to be in that safe and comfortable situation. But sometimes the circumstances where you need that objective ability to look past those schemas are in situations that are by nature not safe and not comfortable. High stakes negotiations or those types of tense interactions where the best thing that you can have is that ability to not get caught in that bias. Is any suggestions for how to navigate that?
Yeah. That's absolutely true. And so, with human beings, when the sympathetic nervous system is fired off, our so-called fight-flight system, we're designed by nature to go down the most used pathways as quickly as possible. We tighten up, and we're not going to experiment too much because we're in danger, if you know what I mean. And so that's going to happen. There's going to be that strong tendency. Now, I think this is where it's a longer term fix. one of the things I talked about in the podcast was mindfulness practice. And there's many things to say about mindfulness, and there's different, definitions of it. But the key to mindfulness is developing a mental capacity to separate somewhat from our thinking and observe it almost as an independent observer, impartial observer. And to notice, for example, our emotional reactions and disengage from those and watch them as a curious, maybe compassionate observer. So you might be in that. Let's say you practice, some of these, mindfulness skills, and then you're in that high pressure situation. You might find you've developed some capacity to step outside your immediate reactivity and to recognize it as such and return to being present from a more spacious awareness. Right? So for me, that's the value of mindfulness practices. It's not about sitting on a cushion or, in lotus position per se. It's more about what's the payoff in everyday life. How can I use this to stay open?
Yeah.
And I think it's not easy, but that's a really great question, because the whole point of this is why would we want to embrace uncertainty? And I think there's reasons like that. My doctoral thesis was on the psychology of creative process, and one of the most well documented predictive factors for people's creative process is a thing called tolerance of ambiguity. And I think it was Teresa Remarkably from Harvard, I think, who'd done a lot of research on that. But anyway, the point is that people who are more creative can hold an ambiguity open longer than most people. They can sit with the uncertainty. Now, what that does is it allows the brain to bring other things into view, to connect other things that aren't normally connected. And so that tolerance for uncertainty is a kind of emotional skill. It's a kind of an emotional resilience. And, people, for example, who have anxiety conditions, they often get training what we call distress tolerance. So they're not as afraid of the feelings of anxiety. They're not running in terror from the anxiety. So we can practice these things in, I think. What else?
You talked about, Terry touched on biases and recognizing biases. Do you feel like do you need a high level of self-awareness in order to recognize what your biases are?
Yeah.
And then I have a second question on that.
I'll start with yes.
Okay.
And the second question?
It was, can you teach somebody self-awareness?
Okay. It's interesting. There's lots of meanings for the phrase self-awareness. But if we just take a very common sense view, that the person has some awareness of their own thinking and emotionality live. All right. And that awareness can allow a person to then moderate the automatic nature, the things that the schemas throw us to. So the first question was, just do we need to garner self-awareness? And the only reason I hesitate on that phrase, and this is probably a bias of mine, is the more one looks internally, whether it's in mindfulness practices, whether it's from a neuroscience perspective, there's no self in here to be aware of. it itself is a heuristic. It's a useful fiction that helps stabilize us, right? So, but, for practical purposes in day-to-day life, I'm a body, and there seems to be this personality that comes around with the body, and, there's memories and so on. But being aware of our habits of thoughts and our habits of feeling as habits, we can start to soften with respect to them, right? And but I guess there's a more positive side here. We'll talk about how you might develop self-awareness. There's a really positive side of this. We talked a bit about creativity before, but what self-awareness does, ironically, I think, it makes us more capable of being non-self-conscious, non-self-aware. And that's actually pretty close to my definition of happiness.
Yeah.
Right? That it's a relief to not be fixated on self, to be self-conscious, to be monitoring self, to be managing impressions of self all the time, but to actually be non-self-consciously in the flow of life, absorbed in what we do, and so on and so on. So how to develop that, of course, is the massive question, right? Like this is like the secret to happiness, etc. Again, I think one of the answers is to develop real awareness of our consciousness and the way that consciousness structures our experience. Now that this might be a whole different Q&A on the nature of consciousness and mindfulness and so on, but I think most definitely that can be developed. And I think the key word here is developing equanimity. And what I mean by equanimity is this very knowledgeable, very objective, very informed, intelligent impartiality. So impartiality is a lovely word because it still implies we're not denying the difficult reality, but we're so objective, we're not trying to push it away either. We're going to accept it, and then we can take effective action. But as I say, that's probably a whole other topic. So, how are we going time-wise, Chris? What should we have one more question? What's your thinking?
Sure. I think we're probably over 10 minutes now, but
okay. So let's do one more. If there's one more observation or question, and then we'll bring it to a wrap.
I was just listening to the self-awareness versus what I call split consciousness. And split consciousness is when you're in a situation that you've been in before. So being a parent, kids react a certain way, and we react a certain way to those kids. And we tend to go down the same rabbit hole time after time after time.
Yeah.
We split our conscious, or we're aware of that we're doing that again, we kind of separate and observe ourselves.
Yeah.
There's a great opportunity to change it. And when you do, the reaction from the other party is profound because they're not ready for that. And usually I found the result was incredibly good versus going down the same rabbit hole again of being a parent and having the discipline and all those type of things, right?
I see. So, yes.
I mean, is that a sense of self-awareness, or is that just a tool?
No. That's definitely a thing. We in psychology, we sometimes refer to what we call reflexive awareness, or more technically, we call it metacognition. But thinking about thinking. But I think I prefer reflexive awareness because it means that we have this awareness live, almost of a routine that's running. One of the schemas is running, and then you become aware that it's running. I think this is the jewel in the crown of Homo sapiens, right? It's the thing that promises freedom, because we can then edit the schema in the ways that you've suggested. Now, interestingly, Terry, I think the example you gave was where perhaps you're realising that there's not wisdom in the schema that's running you. Okay, and
yeah, I'm just going to end up with my daughter in tears. So
yeah, exactly.
Not very. I think we've all dealt with that. So that's not a very beneficial outcome.
So
whether they're right or wrong, and whatever biases are in there, it's just not a good outcome.
Yeah, where I was heading, excuse me, where I was heading was, you know, there's that old-fashioned saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So a lot of our schemas, you know, they're just going to run fine. And in fact, we're comfortable with people when we get into a groove, just like a dance, you know. But when things aren't working, that's where the real cash value of this is.
Yeah.
And then, as you say, it opens up a freshness in the relationship. It opens up the creativity of both partners, because then your children are going, oh, this is new. And their natural creativity is then going to have to create. And that's, I think, that's what enlivens. Yeah. So that's a great observation, Terry, and I think a beautiful way to bring to wrap our Q&A. So I'd like to thank you guys for watching the podcast and bringing those very insightful questions, and I wish you well, and I look forward to doing more of these Q&As.
Thank you, Dr. Chris.
Thank you.
See you guys.